At a Luftwaffe airfield in northern Germany in the spring of 1944, a fighter squadron sat for a pre-mission briefing. On the briefing room floor stood a captured American P-51 Mustang in Luftwaffe markings. Its nose, tail, and underside painted bright yellow to keep German anti-aircraft gunners and German fighter pilots from shooting at it by mistake. The aircraft belonged to the German Air Force's official captured aircraft test unit, the Zirkus Rosarius, and it had been flown in from the test field at Göttingen specifically, so this squadron's pilots could see what the new American fighter looked like up close before they had to dogfight one. The briefing officer told them what the test pilots had concluded after weeks of evaluation. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, he said, were generally superior to this type. The pilots took notes. They went out on their first combat sortie a few days later expecting the briefing to be accurate. One of them, Unteroffizier Kurt Schurer of II. Grupp of Jagdschwader 4, would write the truth into his combat report afterward in one carefully worded sentence. They had soon realized on their first sortie that the statement was not entirely accurate. The understatement is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. What Schurer and the men in his Grupp had encountered in the spring and summer of 1944 over the Reich was the fighter that would break the Luftwaffe. The story of how the Mustang arrived over Berlin to do that is one of the strangest in the history of aircraft design. It begins in 1940 with the British Purchasing Commission walking into the offices of North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, and asking the company to build them more Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks under license, because Curtiss could not keep up with the orders. North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, said his engineers could design and build the British a better fighter than the P-40 in roughly the same time it would take to tool up to copy the Curtiss. The British were skeptical. Kindleberger offered them a contract. He would deliver a prototype in 120 days or take no payment at all. The British signed. North American's design team, led by Edgar Schmude and Lee Atwood, worked through that summer in shifts that finished only when the engineering drawings did. The prototype, designated Na-73X, was rolled out of the hangar on September 9, 1940, 117 days after contract signing. It first flew on October 26 of the same year. The Royal Air Force named it the Mustang. It was a beautiful aircraft, and it was not yet a winning aircraft. The early Mustangs were powered by the American Allison V1710 engine, which gave excellent performance at sea level and at low altitude but lost power steeply above 15,000 feet. The Royal Air Force took the Mustang I into service in early 1942 and used it as a low-level reconnaissance and ground attack fighter, a role it performed beautifully, but did not consider it useful for the high-altitude air combat that was beginning to dominate the European theater. The Allison Mustang was a fast, graceful airframe attached to an engine that was wrong for the war. The fix came from a single Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker. Harker flew a borrowed Royal Air Force Mustang I in April and May of 1942, climbed out of the cockpit, and wrote a memo to Rolls-Royce management arguing that the Mustang's airframe was the cleanest he had ever flown, and that the only thing wrong with it was the engine. He proposed mating the airframe to the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage, supercharged Merlin that powered the Supermarine Spitfire IX. Rolls-Royce installed 5 Merlins in Mustang test airframes through the summer and fall of 1942. The combination was an immediate revelation. The Merlin Mustang, designated P-51B in U.S. service, climbed to 30,000 feet at 1,200 feet per minute, hit 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, and most importantly, could carry external fuel drop tanks that gave it a combat radius of 750 miles. With internal fuel alone, it could fly to Berlin from England and back. With external tanks, it could escort a bomber stream all the way to Vienna. That capability, long-range escort by a fighter that could outclimb and outturn anything the Luftwaffe had at altitude, was what the U.S. 8th Air Force had been waiting for since its bomber crews had started dying in unsupportable numbers over Germany in 1943. The October 14, 1943 raid on Schweinfurt had cost the 8th Air Force 60 heavy bombers out of 291 dispatched. The October raids had effectively halted the deep penetration daylight bombing campaign over the Reich. The 8th had paused, drawn back to short-range raids on the French coast, and waited for an escort fighter that could go the distance. The P-51B reached operational status with the 8th in December 1943. By February 1944, 3 Mustang fighter groups, the 354th, the 357th, and the 4th, were flying escort over central Germany. The bomber campaign resumed. The week of February 20 through February 25 came to be called Big Week, 6 consecutive days of maximum effort raids against the German aircraft industry, fought by bomber streams covered all the way to the targets and back by Mustangs. The Luftwaffe lost roughly 350 fighter pilots in those 6 days. On March 6, 1944, the 8th put 658 bombers over Berlin for the first time, escorted nearly the whole way by Mustangs. The German air defense system was not built to handle American single-engine fighters arriving over the capital city. This is the moment the Zirkus Rosarius briefing officer would have been describing to his squadrons. The German test program had begun in earnest in late 1943, when the first beuteflugzeug captured aircraft. Mustangs had been recovered from crash sites in occupied France and ferried back to the test field at Göttingen. Zirkus Rosarius itself, commanded by Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius and designated formally as 2. Staffel of the Versuchsverband Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe, the 2nd Squadron of the experimental unit of the Air Force High Command, had spent the winter of 1943 to 1944 repairing the captured Mustangs to flight condition and flying them in extensive evaluations against the Bf-109G6 and the FW-190A8. The evaluations were honest in some respects and dishonest in others. The German test pilots, most of them experienced Luftwaffe veterans, correctly identified the Mustang's strengths. Its laminar flow wing made it faster than the Bf-109 at high speed in level flight. Its visibility from the bubble canopy of the later P-51D was incomparable. Its range was beyond anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. They also correctly identified its weaknesses against the German fighters. The Mustang was less maneuverable than the Bf-109 in a tight turn at medium altitude. It climbed more slowly than the FW-190. Its engine cooling system, vulnerable to a single hit, could fail catastrophically. None of those observations was wrong. The dishonesty was in the conclusion. The Zirkus's official summary, distributed through Luftwaffe operational channels by spring of 1944, reduced the comparison to a single sentence: that the Bf-109 and the FW-190 were generally superior, and stopped there. The summary did not emphasize that the comparisons had been conducted at the altitudes and speed envelopes where the German fighters were best, not where the Mustangs were best. It did not adequately acknowledge that the operational reality over the Reich would not be a one-on-one tail chase between a clean Mustang and a clean Bf-109. It would be a sky full of Mustangs at 28,000 feet, fresh, with full ammunition and full fuel, arriving in matched pairs to cover 1,000 B-17s on their way to bomb the city below. This was the gap between the briefing and the combat sortie. The pilots being briefed in the spring of 1944 were not being told a complete lie. They were being told a partial truth that, in the operational tactical environment of the Western Front in 1944, was indistinguishable from a lie. The men who flew sorties against operational Mustangs and survived to land understood the situation within hours of their first encounter. The men who did not survive their first encounter did not get to file a combat report. What had been done to the P-51 since the original Mustang I of 1941 was a process of refinement that the Imperial German Air Force had not done to its own first-line fighters at anything like the same scale. The P-51D, which entered combat over Europe in spring 1944, had the new bubble canopy, 650 caliber machine guns, a more reliable Packard-built Merlin V1657 engine, improved ammunition feed, and improved fuselage fuel tankage. North American built 15,586 Mustangs of all marks during the war, the majority of them at the company's plants in Inglewood, California, and at a second plant in Dallas, Texas. Production at peak ran at over one Mustang every working hour. The Luftwaffe, by 1944, was struggling to keep its Bf-109 production lines fed with aluminum, was using slave labor of dubious skill at the Messerschmitt plants in Regensburg and Augsburg, and was watching its monthly fighter production fall while its monthly fighter losses climbed past replacement. The arithmetic was what eventually mattered. By summer 1944, the 8th Air Force was putting 450 Mustangs into the air over Germany on a maximum effort day. The Luftwaffe fighter arm, Jagdverband, was managing to put up perhaps 250 serviceable fighters on the same day, flown by pilots whose average flight training time had fallen below 150 hours, and whose average combat survival in some Gruppen was being measured in weeks. The kill ratio over central Germany swung quickly against the Luftwaffe in the spring of 1944. By July, it was running at 4-1 against the Germans. The men who flew the captured aircraft demonstrations at Göttingen knew the figures. The men in the operational squadrons learned them in person. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, the head of the German fighter arm, gave a documented post-war interview in which he said the appearance of long-range American fighter escorts over Germany, and specifically over Berlin in early 1944, had been the moment he understood the air war could not be won. The exact phrasing has been rendered several ways by translators. The substance is not in doubt. Galland, looking back, identified the Mustang's arrival over the Reich capital as the strategic turning point. He had reported his judgment up the German chain of command at the time, and had been ignored. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief, had reportedly refused to accept the conclusion that the United States could build a fighter capable of escorting bombers from England to Berlin and back. Göring had called it impossible. Galland had pointed at the wreckage of P-51s being recovered from German fields. Göring had told Galland that the wreckage of American fighters near Berlin only meant the Americans had crash-landed on the way out. Galland had not been able to convince him otherwise. The 8th Air Force kept careful records of where its Mustang pilots claimed kills, and the geographic pattern told a story the Luftwaffe could not refute. Through the spring of 1944, the kill locations crept eastward. In January, most claims came over France and the Low Countries. In February, they came over the Ruhr and Hanover. In March, they came over Berlin itself, and over the airfields of Brandenburg, and over the rail junctions of Saxony. Each shift eastward meant the Luftwaffe had failed to hold its own airspace at the previous line. The Mustang pilots were not trying to be tactical philosophers. They were doing escort and sweep missions, and they were shooting down anything that came up to oppose them. But the cartography of the kill claims, plotted on a map, was the doctrinal collapse of the German air defense system in real time. One specific tactical innovation made the difference greater than the airframe alone could explain. Major General James H. Doolittle, by now commanding the 8th Air Force, having returned from his April 1942 raid and worked his way through the Mediterranean theater, issued a standing order in January 1944 that changed how the Mustangs operated. Previously, escort fighters had been tied to their bomber stream, required to stay close and break off pursuit if a German fighter dove away. Doolittle changed the rule. The Mustangs were now free to pursue German fighters to destruction, to strafe German airfields on the way home, to attack any German aircraft they could find. The bombers would have to absorb a higher rate of interception, while the Mustangs were detached. But the Mustangs would be killing Luftwaffe fighters in the air and on the ground, and the Luftwaffe fighter strength would fall faster than the bombers would suffer. The order was an act of strategic faith. It worked. By June 1944, the Mustang sweeps were finding fewer and fewer Luftwaffe fighters willing to climb to engage them. The aces of the German fighter arm, the Expert, were being killed at a rate the schools could not replace. The Zirkus Rosarius's evaluations had become a kind of professional ritual, conducted around an aircraft that was no longer a curiosity, but a daily reality at 25,000 feet over the homeland. The Zirkus Rosarius itself ended its formal demonstrations in early 1945, as the war ended and the Versuchverband was disbanded. The captured Mustangs in its inventory were flown until they were destroyed or until parts became unobtainable. One Butte Mustang ended its days in a crash near Husum in northern Germany in March 1945, having flown a final demonstration sortie for the pilots of Jagdschwader one a few days earlier. The men who had been shown what an American fighter looked like up close took off 2 days later in their Bf-109 G-14s and met operational Mustangs over the Heligoland Bight. None of the German pilots came home. The lesson of the Mustang for German air doctrine was not that captured aircraft analysis was useless. It was that captured aircraft analysis without honesty about operational conditions was worse than useless. The Zirkus Rosarius had done its technical work competently. What it had not done, what its own institutional position made it almost impossible to do, was tell its own Air Force in print that the Mustang was a war-winning aircraft and that no German fighter in production could match it operationally. To say that in writing in 1944 would have been to admit that the Luftwaffe was beaten. The Zirkus did not say it. The pilots in the squadrons read between the lines or did not and went up to find out for themselves. What Unteroffizier Kurt Schurer wrote in his report, that they had soon realized the briefing was not entirely accurate, has stayed in the German military archives ever since, and any pilot who has read it has understood exactly what he meant. The briefing was not lying about the technical specifications. It was lying about the future. The Mustang was the fighter that escorted the daylight bombing campaign all the way to Berlin and back, that broke the Luftwaffe's interceptor force in the spring of 1944, that made the bombing of German industry survivable for Allied bomber crews, and that arrived in numbers no German production line could match. The captured aircraft sitting in the Zirkus Rosarius hangars at Göttingen was not a curiosity. It was a forecast. The German pilots who took notes during the briefing were being told they would meet a fighter that was technically inferior. What they actually met, when they took off, was the fighter the war would be lost to. The aircraft is still beautiful, 80 years later, on the apron at any restored aircraft airfield where a flying Mustang is kept. The men who flew it operationally are almost all gone. The men who flew against it kept their combat reports. The reports remain in the archives, and Schurer's sentence is in the archives among them, and it still says exactly what he meant it to say.